everyone. I'm Jon Evans, and welcome to season number 8 of the One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast. Our first guest this season is Terry Hayes. Now, Terry had a successful Hollywood screenwriting career, working on many successful films that include Mad Max Road Warrior and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. He also wrote Payback and Dead Calm, which launched Nicole Kidman's movie career. In 2014, Terry fulfilled a lifetime ambition by releasing his first thriller novel. I Am Pilgrim became an international bestseller, landing on many Book of the Year lists. That success, though, brought on problems that took Terry years to overcome. Well, now he's returned with his much-awaited second book. It's called The Year of the Locust, an espionage story about a CIA denied access area operative pushed to the limits to stop a terrorist mastermind from attacking America. This book contains twists and turns that many readers won't see coming. And Terry Hayes joins us from his home. Terry, welcome to the One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I must say first, before we go any further, bravo. I found this to be a terrifically compelling story, filled with the inner workings of the intelligence world and weaving your central character in and out of his life, his missions, and what he sees moving forward. So thank you for this and congratulations.
Well, thank you very much for that. You know, I see myself as a storyteller above and beyond everything else. So to be a storyteller, you have to have an audience. And so to hear a response like that is enormously encouraging, because when you're writing it, you know, you have no idea, John. You have no idea. You go to bed of a night, you think, this is a disaster. Then, you know, another night, rarely, you go to bed and you think, oh, I might have a bit of talent. I got those pages done okay. So to hear somebody discuss the entirety of the book in such great terms is fantastic. Thank you for that.
It's not a sequel to Pilgrim or even really a follow-up. Where did this story come from, Terry?
Well, it took a long time to write it. The publishers all around the world were saying it came from a place of complete madness. What is wrong with him? Why can't he finish it? And that it's a very complicated story. And, you know, wherever I'm living, you know, myself and my family are sort of gypsies in a way. We're in Portugal at the moment. And I wander around and I think up stories or narrative problems to solve. Or mostly I think, wouldn't it be neat if I saw a scene like this, or if this event happened? Well, there was a central event in Locust which became very, very compelling to me. And that's always a good sign, because I know that I'm going to be down there digging trench for many, many months, if not years. So it became a compelling idea, and I started to elaborate on it. And I went down the rabbit hole and, you know, and bit off more than I could chew. But finally, I think I got it into some sort of shape. Yeah. So it was an inspiration that didn't leave me. I have lots of inspirations, but I do know if they leave you, don't chase them. Let them go.
Without spoiling anything for those who have possibly started to read it, you add something more here to the traditional spy or espionage thriller. Did you set out to kind of break the mold a little bit, or to do Terry's spy thriller +1 maybe?
Yeah. Look, John, I have to keep it interesting to myself. If I'm not interested in it, there's no chance anybody else is going to be interested. And also, narrative storytelling, both in movies and perhaps books, is evolving very quickly. You know, we see things in movies which we don't question. Well, yeah, my kids are watching, you know, the Avengers and Spider-Man and all of this stuff. And I come into the room and I say, well, why did he do that? And they say, oh, Dad, come on, get with the program. They don't question it in the way that, say, somebody like me who grew up with much more classic movies and much more classic books. They take narrative leaps, they take risks. The audience expects you to take risks, to try to deliver something that is unusual. We see that with Oppenheimer. We see it with Barbie. These are unusual movies, very different, but very unusual. So I think storytelling in books is not quite as forward thinking. I think it's more conservative. Well, I came from the movies. So I thought, well, we'll have a go at this. We'll try to be really bold. As long as I can take the reader with me on the journey, it will all tie together at the end. So I took a big risk. Time will tell whether it was, worth it or if I really am stupid.
Ironic that you use "time will tell" as your reasoning there, too, for those of us who have read the book. And again,
exactly.
No spoilers here. A couple of characters I'm going to mention here that people will get to know as they read Locust. Have you ever met Kane or Falcon or Kaczynski or somebody who does what they do? Or are they just people from the innards of Terry's mind?
Well, you have to draw the information from somewhere. And yes, I have met people who've worked in that type of environment. And they happen to be men because, this is more historic a nature, and I'm sure there are women doing it now. And some of them are extremely brave people. Denied access area spies go into areas that are totally forbidden. I mean, if I was writing it today, they'd be going into Gaza. If, they're the type of people that go into North Korea. They go into the very, very most forbidden areas of Russia. So I've met a number of intelligence agents, who are very circumspect in what their past missions were. But you get a sense that they are brave people. It's a very, very lonely existence.
Right.
You have to have an incredible amount of inner strength to deal with the anxiety and the fear. So, you take that sort of information, because I used to be an investigative reporter. I met lots of people in very many different, ways of life, and some of them did this type of work. So you take those people and you project them into a story that I'm inventing, and then you try to make it as god-awful, harrowing, and dreadful as your imagination will allow. So,
right.
Kane's, 1 minute Kane's dying of thirst, the next minute he's being strapped to a stake in the water as he watches the tide rise. Another moment he's being shot. Another moment he's having to put maggots on his foot in order to stop an infection. Another moment he's trying to break his wrist to escape from handcuffs. Boy, he was exhausted by the end of it, but that was nothing compared to me. I was like, oh God, can we at least get to the end and have him survive? And so it's a combination of both of those things. The real life that I've lived, combined with what my wife says, a somewhat overwrought imagination.
I read in an interview with you that you said in 2013, did you already have the title picked out for this book?
Yeah, I did.
So then it really germinated for that long a period of time until you went from here to typewriter or to keyboard, right?
Exactly. Look, there's a conventional wisdom in the publishing world that, writers should turn out a book every year or 2 years. That's great. I'm happy for them. But J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, one book in 3 parts, and he wrote The Hobbit. So we could say he only ever wrote 2 books. Well, I'd be very happy to be J.R.R. Tolkien. I really would. I'd be very happy to be J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye and only ever published 1 book, or Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird. I don't think there are any rules. The only rule is, do you have a good story, and do you have the time, the effort, and the craziness to keep working it to get something that you're proud of, And so, yes, it took a long time. And yes, I always thought the Year of the Locust, because I imagined that our bad guy would have a massive locust tattoo on his back, because, they are locusts, are not benign things, that they lay the world to waste. And I thought that's pretty neat. And so I thought, yeah, the Year of the Locust is a good title. The only other thing I ever have is the first line of the book and the last line. So in Pilgrim, the first line is, there are places I'll remember all my life. And that's a line from a Beatles song. And then the last line is, he is risen. He is risen, from the Bible, the story of a man's somebody's resurrection. So that was the case with Pilgrim. With Locust, I knew the last line. Riders on the storm, that's all we are and can ever hope to be. Riders on the storm. I stole that from Jim Morrison of The Doors. And he was a pretty good poet, died too young. And I thought, well, if it was good enough for Jim Morrison, it's good enough for Terry. So I knew where I was going. I knew that he would go through extraordinary experiences, and he'd come out and he'd realize that the universe is neutral. The universe will send you on some terrible, terrible adventures. You'll cross awful landscapes. But if you're a good man and you've got some courage and some ingenuity and some resourcefulness, you just might survive. And he did, God bless him.
I had the hat tip to the Doors coming up later in the interview. You also have a hat tip to James Taylor in there too, which, being an old radio guy, I recognized. So,
great.
What kind of writer are you? Some of the other authors I've had the opportunity to get to know and interview, Jack Carr has an outline for his books. Brad Thor, he'll sit down and it'll just come out as he's at the keyboard. Another author I've interviewed, and I know, Wiley Cash, his latest book, he wrote it out longhand because he wanted to get back to that time in his mind for the story. How does Terry work? Are you an amalgam of that, or are you just straightforward, sit down and whatever sparks goes?
Yeah, I wish it was, John. I wish it was like that. No, I'm sort of dig and ditch, a few inches a day, and it goes for miles. I find it very difficult. I don't find the words difficult. I find capturing the emotion difficult. I think that you come up with a sequence or an event that's in the book, and you know what the dialogue is, and you know how everybody's moving around and what you're trying to achieve. But there's something else. There's like a melody that runs through it. And that melody is the emotion that you're trying to evoke in the reader. Readers, in my view, everybody's got a different opinion about these things, but in my view, readers get into a story because they go on an emotional journey. Right. And so you've got to keep trying to find those emotions. So when Cain is dying of thirst, it's not really good enough to say, well, he was thirsty and his lips were swelling. You have to try to get inside him and convey to the reader, they're really out there. They're really out there in the desert in Iran, and there really is no water, and there really are peregrine falcons circling overhead looking for prey, and there really is no hope. That's the melody to me. That's the difficult thing. So, to me, if I sat down and knew everything that I was going to write, I wouldn't think of myself as a writer. I'd think of myself as a typist. I would just sit there and that'd be great. Don't get me wrong, that would make me very happy. But I like the creative thing of knowing a few paragraphs or knowing what this chapter's about, and then thinking, but hang on, what about if this happened? Raymond Chandler, great noir writer, he said a great thing, I think, advice to all would-be writers. If in doubt, have a blonde come through the door with a gun. Now, he didn't know what the blonde was going to do. He didn't know why she had a gun. He knew, though, that you had to get the reader to sit up and say, well, what in damnation is happening now? Now you've got to solve it. So I'm sitting there and I've got an idea, I've got lines of dialogue, I've got notes, I've got lots of things. But sooner or later, I'm going to say to myself, this is getting a bit boring. I better have a blonde come through the door with a gun. And off you go, and you try and solve that problem.
Listeners to this podcast need to go to my Jon Evans TV YouTube page because I'm going to show something here. This shows all the markings that I have as I went through Year of the Locust. And there were more than this. I just ran out of paper. These markings to me always signify great writing or something that I say, wow. And Terry, you were just talking about emotion. I'm going to read one of these that I have here and talk about emotion as what you do here. You say, I can promise you the terror on the face of the condemned, as everything that they had hoped would be vanishes into eternity, never leaves you. The memory of it will surface at 3 a.m. when everything you fear most in the world is on its way, coming up the stairs to find you. I'm like, wow. Because everybody has had that thought at 3 a.m, like, did I just hear that noise in the house? That to me is great writing. And that to me brings that emotion of not only remembering, but maybe a hair or two standing up on the back of your neck.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's a huge compliment. And the number of markings you've got on the book is a testament to, despite what the people on Amazon say, I'm not a complete idiot. You try to craft what you're talking about there, those paragraph or two, you try to craft an emotion out of very little. It would be easy to say, well, I'd seen a number of people executed and it's not very pleasant. Get on with the next bit. But you've got to try to take them into that. You've got to try to get look, it's the same in movies. You're trying to get the viewer to go down that track with you. In a book, it's much harder. You don't have the music, you don't have set design, you don't have a great cinematographer, you don't have a fantastic director. It's just you. But you have to get them, to get your reader, to pay tribute to the reader, to make it certain that it's worthwhile for them to invest their time, to read things like that and say, well, he's sort of got that right.
Oh, there's a lot you got right in here. There's a lot you got right. This book comes in at about 780, close to 800 pages. But again, in another interview I heard from you, you submitted more than 1 million words for this book.
Yeah. There's 270,000 words in the published version of the book. I actually wrote, it's on my Word document. I had to hone it all down. I couldn't expect an editor to do this, but I actually wrote 1,080,000 words.
Wow.
So basically, I threw away 800,000 words. But look, Bob Dylan's a hero of mine. For once, the Nobel Committee got it right. I think he was the greatest poet of the 20th century. And he won the Nobel Prize for writing, so he knows a thing or two, I guess. He said once, you've got to write 100 songs in order to find one good one. Oh. And I understand that. Now, I'm not saying that a lot of people would want to do that or have the financial resources to spend that amount of time, the mental perseverance. I don't know. But that's me. And if it's not good enough, it doesn't join the other paragraphs or pages or chapters that I like. Mm-hmm. So each one, it's building brick by brick a thing that I can be proud of and that my 4 kids can be proud of. Long after I've gone, they will, I hope, be able to read my books and say, that's Dad. Dad did that. And boy, he really went the limit, He didn't leave anything on the field. So, yeah, it was 1,080,000 words. And I only wish that I got paid per word. Now, if I got paid per word, I would have submitted all of them. I can promise you, John.
Does your past career creep into this one? And the way I ask it is, do you write the novels, Pilgrim and now Locust, with an eye toward how it might look on a screen in a Netflix or an Amazon Prime series or a Hollywood blockbuster?
Yeah. I keep trying to escape my past, but I can't. I think I've worked with some of the great directors of the world, people who won Oscars and deservedly so. Worked with some great actors, and that I've been blessed. And what I've realized, especially with the directors, is they think in extremely visual terms, whereas I think more in words. But I learnt enough to know that I might think in words, but I also have to picture the scene. Mm-hmm. So I'm always picturing the scenes, the chapters. What does this look like? So it's natural that my writing reads more like a movie, because that's how I grew up. My youngest son, he's 16. He read Locust, after I'd finished it, and I said to him at the end, "Well, what did you think, Dylan?" Dylan, we guess who he's named after. And I said, "What did you think, Dylan?" He said, "It's great, Dad." Now, he's my son. Of course, he's going to say that, or otherwise he's going to have his allowance cut off. But he said, "It's great, Dad." I said, "Yeah, but, talk to me about it." He said, "Well, I'll tell you, he reads a lot. He reads a real lot." Mm-hmm. He said, "I'll tell you what I think." He said, "I think most books I read are in black and white." He said, "Locust is in Technicolor."
Yeah.
I thought, I'll take that any day. Yep. I'll take that any day. So, yeah, if you work in that filmed environment, and that had never been my intention in my life. I'd always thought I would be a journalist and become a novelist and all that, but I ended up working in movies for a long time. You learn a lot. You learn to think about what it looks like. So, yes, I am not at all surprised that both books are being, talked about as, well, Pilgrim certainly being adapted into a feature film, and I think Locust will go to one of the streamers. That's my guess.
Yep, and I agree with Dylan. I think that's a great concept. It's not just words on pages. It's a theory. It's an adventure. That's why I took from it. And again, I'm a reader that I'm going to give you my time, and I'm not going to think what it means. I'm not going to think here. I'm not going to think what this might symbolize. I'm just going to go. And if I am entertained, I'm going to turn the page. And that did it for 786 pages for me. And at times, my wife would say, "What are you reading, pleasure or work?" I said, "Both."
Right. Great.
Both.
Great. Yeah. And, and funnily enough, John, I think like that. I get to the end of a paragraph and I ask myself a question. I say, okay, I'm Mr. Neutral Reader. Do I want to read the next paragraph?
Right.
I get to the end of the page. I say, do I want to read the next page? The end of the chapter, the same thing. If I can answer honestly without my own prejudices entering into it, if I can answer honestly, yes, I know that I'm on solid ground. Now, the hardest thing is to write something that you really love and then say, yeah, I love it. Nobody else will. So it goes. Yep. You can't be precious. They're not your children. I mean, there's plenty of times all of us who are parents think that it'd be good if the children went, but no, I can't afford that attachment. I write because I love being a storyteller, mm-hmm. and it has to work for me and hopefully work for the audience. I don't want to tell stories and stand there, start off and there's 500 people around the campfire, and then I look up and there's 3 left and they're all asleep. No, I don't want to do that. I want the 500 people to be yelling out at the back, "Come and listen to this. Come on. This is pretty good." That's my aim. I don't know whether I achieve it, but at least it's my aim.
Yeah, you did. Bullseye both times. You've had success prior to the release of Pilgrim. But again, as I've listened to you speak in other interviews, it was a different kind of success after Pilgrim, and it affected you in a way that was maybe different than you expected, correct?
Yeah. It took me completely by surprise, which, is probably a testament to my insensitivity. I don't know. All my life I'd wanted to be a novelist ever since I was a kid. I was a migrant kid. I into a very alien environment, Australia, with a very, very difficult home life. My mother was not a well woman at all, psychologically, and she really did her best, but it was not quite what one would want. And so I took refuge in reading. Well, you know what it's like. You're young, you read a lot, you look around at the local library or the local bookstore, there's tens of thousands of books, and you think to yourself, well, this can't be that hard. Look at all these people that do it. So I became, other kids become want to become astronauts or firemen or whatever. I wanted to be a writer, and I never altered. I never changed. It wound into my DNA all of my life. And of course, as you get older, you read, great books, and you think, well, that's what I'd like. I'd like to have a book that's highly regarded, incredibly popular. I don't want to write books that are well received by critics in esteemed newspapers and nobody ever picks up. I don't want to do that. No, I thought I want to write something that is critically well received, and I would very much like it if it reached a worldwide audience. So that became a lifelong ambition, and it motivated me for decades. Well, Pilgrim came out, and I sort of got a lot of it. Quite unexpectedly. I had no idea whether the book was any good. By the time I'd finished it, I was just glad to be done with it. And that I had no idea. And I got a phone call from the British publisher. I was staying in the back garden of the house in Australia. And he said to me, this is going to be huge. I said, oh, really, Bill? He said, yeah, it's going to be huge. He said, I'm seeing the pre-orders from the various book chains and bookstores. He said, it's really going to do something that maybe you never expected. He said, I always expected it. And then he said to me, you don't sound very happy. I said, well, no, I'm happy. Of course I'm happy. I said, but I'll tell you one thing. My life will never be the same.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean by celebrityhood or being interviewed by people like yourself and people I respect and their opinion and hearing praise. I didn't mean that. I'd lost something. I'd had this desire for so long, and it was no longer there. It had been fulfilled. It's that Chinese proverb, be careful what you wish for, you might get it.
Right.
And I got it. And I was empty. I had this huge hole that I didn't know how to fill. Somebody had taken away this major strand of my DNA. And the conventional wisdom is you go and drink champagne and go and visit the Ferrari dealership. But it was not like that. It was vastly different. My wife said to me, you're really lost, aren't you? I said, yeah, I am. It took a long time to come to terms with the fact that I'd done something that I'd wanted to do for so many decades, and that people had been so kind about it. I quite expected that the book would come out. Let's say this is the worst thing I've ever read, and that's similar to a movie. I wrote Road Warrior, Mad Max 2, and that was the first movie I ever wrote. And I remember sitting in the audience, a public audience, and people say, "Oh God, you must be proud, see your name up there," and all that. No, I wasn't like that. I'm sitting there thinking, please don't laugh at the film. Don't laugh at the funny bits, but
right. Don't
sneer at it. If we survive this, I'll be happy. So it was a very unexpected thing. And I'd had a group of terrible events had occurred during the writing of Pilgrim. As I mentioned, we were a migrant family. And there were just the four of us, mum, dad, my older brother and myself. And we had no grandparents in Australia, no uncles, aunts, cousins, extended family, friends. We didn't know anybody. So it was a very tight, family unit in very, very difficult circumstances. But okay. So when I was 200 pages into Pilgrim, too far in to abandon it, not far enough in to see the end, my brother visited me unexpectedly at the house. We were both living in Sydney at the time, and told me he had cancer. Oh. And he told me what sort of cancer he had. And I said, well, how long do they say? He said 6 months to a year. Well, they were right at the lower end. He lived 6 months and then passed away. About 4 or 5 months after that, I had the rather unpleasant duty, which I wouldn't wish on anybody, of standing in a hospital corridor and talking to the doctors and them telling me that there was no hope for my dad and that he was in a lot of pain. And so I told them that they could turn the machines off. 6 months later, my mum passed away.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So within a year, I lost all my family. Mm. And look, that's life, it's tough on occasions. And I'm not complaining about that. I'm just saying that I had to finish Pilgrim, and I did finish it. And I finished it to what I thought was a very high order. But there was nobody there, John. Nobody that had known that kid who wanted to be a writer could celebrate and share it. Yeah. None of them saw the book published. And of course, I had my wife and my own children, but they weren't there all those decades before when I was, 7 or 8 or whatever. And so I had a lot of grieving to do. After Pilgrim came out, I had this hole where ambition had been, where desire, where everything I'd ever thought of being had once resided and had now been to some extent satisfied. And I had a lot of things to process, which I never had time for when I was writing Pilgrim. I just had to get up in the morning and say, this is pretty awful, but let's think about the story. Let's think about what the next page is. So it was a difficult time and unexpected on every level. And I'm a blessed person. Despite what may have happened, because I got to live my dream. But it took me a while to work that out,
You were born in England. You said, as you said earlier, your family moved to Australia. You began your career as a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald. You said you always wanted to be a writer, but what did you maybe like better in that journalism career and the career that I've been in now for almost 40 years? Did you like the reporting side? Did you like the writing of the reporting, or was it all of it put together?
The people. I have never had so much fun in my life as going for a drink with other journalists, because they tell you the real story. They tell you the real story, not what we published the night before or the day before. They were, especially back then in Australia, they were eccentric, they were highly talented, very knowledgeable, and very irreverent. And for a young person like myself, they were wonderful. We had one reporter from very wealthy circumstances. The rest of us were when you're very young, being forced to travel by bus or metro or whatever, because the newspapers were always trying to save money. He went to his stories in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. Now, this occasioned quite a bit of interest amongst people that he was interviewing. Yeah. I'm sure that he never got an interview like anybody else did, because he'd turn up like this. So they were very interesting people. I loved the idea that a young man could walk up to the Prime Minister of Australia and ask difficult or rude questions. I mean, if the public said half this stuff to our leading politicians, that would have been awful. But journalists got away with so much. So I liked the whole milieu of it. I liked the newsroom late at night when you're right on deadline and everybody's screaming and there was a lot of energy. I liked the writing. I did. I liked the writing. I wasn't too keen on having to take notes because I was always doubtful that I had got it right. Yeah. And, you know, in Australia, we had very, very strict defamation laws and people were always suing us at the newspapers. So, you know, you had that frisson of fear, but I loved it. To this day, now, you know, it's different because I'm a much older person and my life has taken in different directions. But to this day, I always say to my kids, it was the greatest 8 or 9 years, 10 years, whatever it was, when I was the right age in the right place at the right time, the greatest life you could have ever imagined. And I wouldn't swap that for all the best-selling novels or big box office movies. I wouldn't swap that for anything because it helped make me what I am today. And I remember those people that I worked with such enormous affection. They were crazy, half of them, but I'm sure they look at me and think, oh, I remember him with affection, but he was really crazy. So, yeah, it was a great time.
We all have those 4 or 5 people from those early days. I can rattle them off on my hand, that really set the tone of the rest of your career for your, not only your ambitions, but what you expected of yourself, how you treated others, and whether you were going to be a good journalist or somebody who, in my essence, wanted to just be on television, because there's 2 different paths there. And there's one to be a journalist and there's one to be somebody on TV. But you, another thing that I read, you were a correspondent in the U.S. during the time of Watergate. And what I wanted to ask you was, I've never interviewed any of the reporters at the time back then in D.C. Did you have any inkling of how much that was going to change the public's distrust of government, or how big that was going to be as it was unfolding?
Yeah, not because I was very wise, but because I was an outsider. I think to a lot of the American reporters, they're so wound up in the political life of their country that, you know, which is understandable, that they didn't quite have the perspective. I was 21. To this day, I'm the youngest foreign correspondent ever appointed by an Australian newspaper group. And so I arrived in America with, you know, all the stupidity but enthusiasm of a 21-year-old. I landed in Los Angeles. I'd never been out of Australia before, except as a migrant child. I landed in Los Angeles the day that a guy called Alexander Butterfield was being questioned by the Senate Watergate Committee. And the person questioning him later said he just went on a fishing expedition. He just said, "Mr. Butterfield, you seem to have an incredible memory for what was said in the Oval Office." And Butterfield doesn't reply, so he gets pushed, you know, like question. And then finally Butterfield said, "Well, yes, that's because all the conversations in the Oval Office are recorded." Now that changed the whole nature of Watergate, because prior to that, it was a he said, she said sort of thing, you know, who said what, who said what. Now there were recordings. And if you recall, 18 minutes or whatever it was of those tapes magically disappeared. Oh, you know, oh, we didn't record that part. So Watergate on that day moved from something that was politically partisan and unable to be proved, perhaps. The wrongdoing was now really front and center, and all that had to be done was get access to those tapes. Well, I arrived in Los Angeles, and even I knew this was a watershed moment. This was something. And because I had a different perspective on these things, and probably a lot of ignorance about American politics, I did think this is going to change American life very significantly. Politicians are going to be damn lucky to escape this unscathed as a class of people. And if you recall, Spiro Agnew was, indicted for accepting money in brown paper envelopes. So there was a lot of stuff going on. And I think that to this day, my wife's American, so her kids are American, so I have a great interest. And I think to this day, we live with that damage that was done to the body politic. Yes. By people lying and people covering up and people taking money and at both sides of politics, trying to either defend their position or use it as a club to hit somebody else over the head. So what is happening in America now, the political sort of schism that has developed, that didn't happen overnight. That started with a certain feeling of, whichever way you vote, a politician gets in. That it was not a matter of, following a particular ideology. There's enormous distrust for all politicians. That's not just America. I mean, I spent a lot of time in England, and the socialist prime minister here in Portugal just had to resign thanks to a corruption scandal. We've had things like that in Australia. I don't think anybody likes them very much.
How did you go from reporter to then screenwriter, Hollywood life, and then subsequently realize it was time to get away from that Hollywood life?
Yeah, I was working as a radio producer. I'd left print journalism, and I'm a restless individual. I like new experiences, so I left print journalism and wrote really for one of Australia's leading current affairs program, and I was the producer, and we created a pretty good program, and I met a publisher who was always trying to get his guests on our program. I know how it works from the other side now. And he said, would you be interested in meeting a guy who is starting out as a film director? I said, oh yeah, why, Maury? Why? He said, well, he's read this Pauline Kael book, and in the intro to the book, Pauline Kael makes the point that during the golden years of Hollywood, the greatest screenwriters were journalists, because they had a different take on what the public was thinking or looking for. They know how to entertain, but they know how to do something rooted in reality. Well, this guy, this would-be film director, had read this, so he thought, well, maybe I should meet some journalists. And I had a reasonably high profile due to other things that I'd done in the field of, journalism. So Maury, the publisher, said, will you meet him? And I said, yeah, all right. So he came into my office. He's shorter than me, fatter than me, black curly hair, Greek heritage, absolutely charming man, obviously very intelligent. And we got chatting, and he said, well, actually, I'm a medical doctor. And I thought, are you out of your mind? There was no film. There's no film industry in Australia worth the name, really. Not at that stage. It was, this was right at the start of the Australian new wave of cinema and all of that. Right. And I thought, why would you give up a highly regarded, well-paid job like being a medical doctor to go and do this? Anyway, I didn't ask him that. I didn't know him well enough. And but it's very, very difficult to become a doctor in Australia via Sydney University. The academic standard is incredibly high. And so I thought, well, he is smart. even if he's done something really stupid, he seems to be pretty smart. So he said, look, I made this film. He said, hardly any money. I think it was $300,000 or something. He said, do you want to come and see it? I said, oh, yeah. So we get in his car, terrible driver, and the smallest car I'd ever been in. And we drive for miles out into the suburbs where we get to this house. To this day, I don't know whose house it was, but he seemed to be sleeping on the couch. And in the living room, he had this editing, what we call flatbed editing machine in the old days. You know, you ran the film through it. And anyway, he had like a 17-inch black and white TV set. And so he showed me this film, except he couldn't hear half the dialogue. There were huge sections missing. And he was filling them in as we were talking, and there were no special effects because he couldn't afford any special effects. So everything was done for real. And anyway, he gets to the end. He said, what do you think? And even then, I think I was well suited to Hollywood because I said, oh, very interesting. You avoid giving an opinion. And that. So I said, oh, it's very interesting. He said, oh, good, good. He said, what do you think of the lead actor? I said, oh, I thought he was good. He said, yeah, I think he's just started. I think he's going to be a star. I said, oh, really? Good, good. I said, he's a handsome guy. He said, yeah, very handsome, but he's also a very good actor. I said, what's his name? He said, oh, Mel Gibson. I said, oh, okay. It didn't mean anything to me. It could have been Terry Hayes. And I said, oh, yeah. I said, what you going to call the movie? He said, oh, I'm going to call it Mad Max. Yeah. And that was Mad Max 1. And anyway, we became friends and we worked together. And we made a few, what I think are pretty good movies. Yeah, I'm certainly proud to have my name on them. And that. So I sort of got sidetracked into this. And people will tell you, or they tell me all the time, gee, you were lucky. Oh, yeah. I earned a lot of money as a current affairs radio producer of a really top flight radio program. And I was unmarried and I was young and it was all disposable income and I had a really pretty terrific life. And one day I'm working with George on a script that eventually became Mad Max 2 Road Warrior. And I'm working with him. We've been working for quite a few months. I said, oh, George, I think I should talk to you about the financial side of this. I was working as a radio producer from like 5 a.m. till 1 p.m. and then I'd have a bite to eat and I'd go and work with George until I fell asleep. So I was working very, very hard. And I thought, well, maybe I should get some money for this. He said, yeah, that's a good idea. I said, so how does it work? He said, well, he said, you'll get paid 25,000 Australian dollars. Well, I found it pretty easy to spend 25,000 Australian dollars in a month or two. And I thought, this is not what you read about, in the newspapers. I said, well, I said, I don't think I'll be able to give up the day job. He said, no, I wouldn't do that. I said, oh, good. He said, because, you get the $25,000 if the movie's made. I said, well, what do I get if it's not made? He said, nothing. I said, I guess we better work a bit harder and that. So people are all, well, always, but I've been told many times, oh, you were very lucky. Yeah, I was. I was lucky I met him. Wasn't lucky that I took the risk. I say to my kids all the time, they think I'm a moron, but I say to them all the time, hey, guys, opportunity doesn't make an appointment. It doesn't. It doesn't even knock on the door.
No.
You're just sitting there and suddenly there's an opportunity. Now, you have a choice. You can either grab it or you can turn back and watch your TV. So opportunity came. It did. And because I'd always wanted to be a writer and because director's name's George Miller, he's won a couple of Oscars and he's one of the great film directors probably of our generation. And but I saw in him a decency and a desire to explore things, which is very rare. Nothing was too much trouble for George. My kids tell me, they say, don't ask Dad what the weather's like. Never ask Dad what the weather's like, because he'll start at the Big Bang Theory, the creation of the universe. Kids, you have to understand how the universe was created if you want to know whether you should put a sweater on when you go outside. George was like that. He was always intellectually curious, taught me so many things, not about filmmaking, but other stuff in the world. So I was very, very fortunate, John. I would never deny that. But I also found somewhere within myself the ability to grab the opportunity. Well, Road Warrior was a success, and then I made Dead Calm, and that launched Nicki Kidman's career. And then Hollywood came calling. So I went to Hollywood, and that was a miserable experience. But I met my wife. We've got 4 great kids, so it all turned out good in the end.
In the long run, it did. You may not have ever visited Wilmington, North Carolina, but you actually have a distant connection to Wilmington. One of the screenplays or scripts you worked on, with I don't believe you got a credit for it, was The Crow with Brandon Lee. The Crow was actually made and shot here at the studios here in Wilmington. And unfortunate, it had the tragedy with Brandon losing his life with the onset accident. But what memories do you may have of that, which is your connection to our little part of the world here?
Well, I had no idea. I had no idea it had been shot in Wilmington. I didn't, but of course, since The Crow was made, Wilmington's become quite a storied place to go and make films, and not just any films. I mean, a number of great films have been made there. And many, many times, movies that I've worked on, people have said, we'll go to Wilmington, because I think the facilities are very highly regarded. And, you know, there are many financial advantages, but also shooting in, you know, LA is a nightmare, and shooting in New York's even worse. And so if you can find a really embracing and positive environment, that was wonderful. My contribution to The Crow was sitting in an office in LA, talking to Alex Proyas, the director, and coming up with ideas and trying to, you know, craft up the screenplay. And that's the way of things in Hollywood. You know, there's very few. I mean, Chris Nolan wrote and directed Oppenheimer himself. That's very rare for one writer to be credited on a movie. It's generally done by 2, 3, 4, God knows how. You know, if you're talking about some of the Marvel movies, there's hardly a writer in Hollywood that hasn't worked on it. You know, so my contribution was, I think, positive, and certainly, you know, I think it was a very, very good film, unfortunately overshadowed by the events that you refer to, you know, the tragic accident with Brandon, who was clearly going to be a huge movie star. And that, so I don't think the film ever quite, at its period of release, escaped all of that very, very awful thing that happened. But I do think it's a very good film. I'm very proud to have had an involvement with it.
You had so much success with Hollywood and screenwriting, as we already talked about the Mad Max movies, Payback. You also worked on several other high-profile films. When did it come time to say, okay, I'm done? You talked in other interviews about some of your experiences, the fast drive down the boulevard and some of the late night hobnobbing. But when did that just become too much and you decide to say, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to go another way?
It's hard to say when disillusionment actually started. But, you know, I'd made movies in Australia, and due to not having any money for the budget and having to use the resources at hand, and because of the nature of Australians, they tend to not look upon hierarchies very kindly. So I'd grown up in that fairly collegial environment where nobody was treated with unalloyed respect. People, take a shot at you and tell you that, that isn't very good, or, this could be better. And that's across all the crew and all the people that are making it. So there were no silos in Australia. Of course, there was a director. Of course, there was a writer. There were producers, but there were no real silos. You go to Hollywood and everybody exists in a silo. Everything is to do with status. Everything is to do with how close is my parking space to the chairman or president's office. You can't just go and sit wherever you like in the commissary, I remember going to lunch one day with Rennie Harlan. Rennie's a Hollywood film director who did one of the Die Hard movies and had a huge career back in those days. And we walked into the most fashionable restaurant in Hollywood at the time. And they take us to our table, and Rennie says, "This is great. This is really great." I said, "Oh, yeah, it's nice." What did I know? I was from Australia. He said, No, this is really great. This is one of the 2 power tables in this restaurant. I had no idea, John, what a power table was. a power table in Australia was if you got a cushion on your bench, it was sort of like, so that was Hollywood. Driving around Hollywood with him in his Ferrari. He was unmarried, I was unmarried, and go to, places where people are queued up and there are velvet ropes and they lift the rope and in you go. And that. But I can't say that ever sat very well with me. Of course, it's nice to enjoy, but I was Australian. I think, well, this is a bit stupid. Why would you queue up to go to a nightclub anyway, let alone let people like us in front of them? So it never sat particularly well with me. But, I was working on interesting projects. But I think when I went to Hollywood, now I'll get the figures probably marginally wrong, and there'll be all those people, with Google open who will say, "Oh, well, he didn't get that right." But I think when I went there, the studios were making around about 150, 160 movies a year, some small budget, some bigger budget. Now they make about half that number. It's very difficult to get a project made. It's really difficult. And if you're a writer, you can use your skill to make a lot of money. You can, and you can have a great life. I mean, my now wife, she's my girlfriend there, we lived in a beautiful house in Bel Air, and Ronald Reagan had left the presidency many years before, and his house was just down the road. It was a dead-end street, so in order to get to our house, you had to drive past Reagan's. Well, the Secret Service were there the whole time. I liked it. I thought, this is neat. I don't think we're going to get killed in our beds tonight. So, we drove nice cars and, we didn't have any kids. You can have that. And you can have that without ever having a movie being made, by rewriting other people's movies and not getting credited. Yeah. Well, it's hard. I didn't like that. I figure I've got a voice and I'd like to be heard, and on some movies, they'll have 8 writers. So what do? You sit there with your kids and say, "No, wait. That line of dialogue, that was mine. Now, go back to popcorn." I didn't want that. I wasn't used to that. Yeah. So with a diminishing number of movies being made, an increasing number of writers being used on each movie, I pretty soon, well, not pretty soon, but I eventually came to the conclusion that there was no future in this, that if you wanted to say, have a voice of your own and have that voice heard, you better think of something different. So I said to my wife one day, we'd moved down to Australia. I didn't want to go back. I'd lived there. I'd had that experience. She'd never been there. I said, it's fine. 3 years, you'll get bored with it, and then we'll move on. Well, she never got bored with it. She loved it. And because it was close enough to America, she was from Southern California. I met her at Paramount. The weather and that, it was close enough to all of that to feel familiar. But it's, Sydney is a lovely place to live. So we ended up staying down there longer than I had anticipated. And I was writing movies down there and flying to LA and what have you. And I said to her one day, I said, I've been thinking a lot about this. I said, if J.K. Rowling had written Harry Potter as a screenplay, it would never have been made. Yeah. She said, you figure? I said, yeah, I figure. I said, it'll go to a reader. Readers at all the studios who are pretty low on the totem pole, and they get rewarded for saying no to things generally, and highly creative things are challenging. Can you imagine what a reader would have said to Chris Nolan's Oppenheimer script? They would have said it's incomprehensible. And anyway, who wants to know about a bomb that was dropped all those years ago? No. But I said, they're going to say, some set in England, it's some story about some kid, thinks he's a wizard and he lives under a cupboard and owls come and give him a message, and it's sort of silly. That would have been the end of it. But she wrote it as a book. And of course, the book became a phenomenon. And even Hollywood can recognize that. Even Hollywood can say, wow, Hollywood likes things that have been endorsed in another medium. TV shows. Yeah. A doll with Barbie. Historical events with Oppenheimer. Lots of things. If it's been endorsed in another medium, and books are a great thing for that, they will sit up and listen. So I said to my wife, I'm going to write a book. I'll write a novel, which I've always wanted to do, and I'm getting older, and I am going to do it. And if I do it right, it'll sell really well as a book, and we'll sell the rights to Hollywood. She said, oh, yeah, all right. So off we went. She said to me after a while, she said, how are you going? I said, oh, a bit harder than I thought. She said, we have a very expensive lifestyle. We have 4 kids. They were home educated, not by my wife and I. Oh, God, they wouldn't be able to read or write if it was left to me. But we hired tutors to teach them. We travelled a lot, take them skiing, do all this. She said, do you think we're going to be able to sustain this on what you earn as a novelist? I said, oh, I guess. Anyway, I finished the book. In all these difficult circumstances, I finished it. And my agent for books called me up and said, great news. It's going to sell to England and it's going to sell to America. They've read this stuff. I think we sent them 250 pages initially. And they want to do a deal. I said, oh, Jay, that's fantastic. He said, yeah, great news. You're going to be a published novelist. And then said something very interesting. Said, if you want a career as a best-selling international author, you can have it. I said, yeah, that sounds good. I said, by the way, how much are they going to pay? He said, well, the advance is $40,000. What? Or what? The kid's French tutor gets paid more than that. And I said to my wife, I said, you're talking about our lifestyle. I think you're going to have to start looking at the price of things before we buy them. And she said, oh, no, tell me how bad it is. I said, it's really bad. It's really bad. Nobody makes any money from writing novels. Well, some people do, and I became fortunate. But, it was really out of frustration with Hollywood and coming up with a different business plan. And both books have been extremely well received by Hollywood. So maybe I got that right. I like to think I did. And
I believe you did too. And Pilgrim, a huge success. Locust, I predict you're also going to have huge success. What is next? You've mentioned rights to a film. You've mentioned a streaming series, but what is next on Terry's to-do list that you have to check off?
Yeah, I was exhausted 3/4 of the way through Locust, really exhausted, like mentally, emotionally. $1,080,000 worth were clocking up real fast. It was like buying the worst car on the lot. You look at how many miles it's done. And you think, oh my God, that's never going to get down the end of the street. That was how I felt. And that, so there's at a very low ebb. And I got a call from the British publisher, and he was reading Locust as he went. He said, well, you're getting close to the end. I thought, no, well, I don't know. He thinks so, but I don't know whether that's true. But I was in a psychologically vulnerable state. And he said, you should write Pilgrim 2 next. I said, oh, yeah. He said, it'd be very good. He said, creatively, it'd be very good because you really know those characters. He said, I think business-wise, it would be a very, very powerful deal that you could get. He said, you are well loved by the readership. I said, I don't know whether I am. I said, I think the characters might be. And he said, do you want to do it? So as I said, I was in a vulnerable state, and then late at night, I had a real, brain freeze. And I said, yes. Yeah, all right, I'll do it. And that's so now I have to live with it. It was sort of say yes in haste and regret at leisure, I'm looking forward to it very, very much, to be honest. I like him. He's frustrating, Scott Murdoch, or whatever his real name is. It's frustrating because he's very misanthropic. He's a loner. He doesn't seem to drink. He took drugs years ago, but he gave that up. As far as I can work out, he's only ever had sex once in his life. So he's not a fun guy to spend your life, but he's pretty clever, and he can outthink a lot of people. So I'm committed to doing that, and which I am developing at the moment. I've got a great opening sequence. I've got the first line, I've got the last line, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. And I've got a great core emotional relationship in it, and most of my characters from the first one do come back, but you will not have had to have read the first one to, I hope, enjoy Pilgrim 2. At the moment, it's got a working title of Pilgrim Nightfall, because a lot of darkness. But Martin Luther King said a great thing, it's only when you're in the deepest darkness that you can see the stars. And that's my guiding thing for this particular book. So I'm doing that. And then when I get bored with his rather unpleasant attitude to the world, I think, go out and have some fun, will you? Why don't you go for a walk along the beach and stop worrying about somebody who's going to end life as we know it? I am developing a modern day pirate story, funnily enough, set in the Malacca Straits next to Singapore, surrounding Singapore, world's busiest sea lane, and where piracy actually started. It didn't start with Johnny Depp and Pirates of the Caribbean. I know my kids find this surprising, but it started there. And these are modern day pirates, and it involves the world's, at that stage, the world's largest drug shipment. And so it's a cross between Narcos and Pirates of the Caribbean, I guess.
Well, if you're looking for a walk on the beach, come to southeastern North Carolina. We have plenty of beach, plenty of coast, and people will leave you alone if you just walk on the beach to enjoy the morning. So I'm inviting you to the Wilmington area to take advantage of our beaches if you're looking for that stroll to have nobody bother you.
Well, I don't mind them bothering me as long as they don't come up and tell me all the mistakes I made. I say to people, look, it's 250,000 words in Pilgrim. It's 270, 280 or whatever it is in Locust. I haven't heard from one person, John. Congratulations. You got 90% of them right. No, they all say to me, you got the 10% wrong, or whatever. But no, my publisher in America, Emily Bessler at Atria Books, comes to exactly where you are every year and is always raving to me about the beaches and the area and the type of people. So I will be there. Don't worry. My wife keeps wanting us to go on a vacation to America. And, we both know America. Well, she knows it better than I do. So we will head over your way. I will knock on your door and say, do you want to go for a walk on the beach?
Once again, the new book is The Year of the Locust by Terry Hayes, available February the 6th here in the U.S. And on his upcoming book tour, Terry is going to be at Park Road Books in Charlotte on February the 8th. Terry, once again, please ignore all of my bookmarks here. That is, in my mind, some of your best work inside a great book. Thank you for this, and thank you for taking the time today to join my One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It's been real fun, a total joy to talk to you and to talk about journalism and books and all the other stuff and not be asked about whether I dated Nicole Kidman. It's wonderful. Thank you.
A big thank you to Terry Hayes for taking time from his busy schedule to join us for the first episode of Season 8 here on the One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast. Once again, The Year of the Locust is available in the United States February the 6th. Now, you can learn more about Terry and the stops on his upcoming book tour by checking out his page on simonandschuster.com. Now, before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please follow and subscribe to the One-on-One with Jon Evans podcast on whatever app you use to listen to your favorite shows. And if you would be so kind, please leave us a rating or a review. We do want to know what you think of our interviews. And the more feedback we have from friends like you, the higher we'll be listed on the apps, the better chance we'll have of bringing in even more new listeners. I'm Jon Evans. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of One-on-One.